I never thought I would get to come here. When I got this invitation, I really could not resist. Oh, microphone. So, I'm very glad to be here. Is it on? Yeah. Okay, good, thank you. So my talk comes really as a culmination in some ways of a long journey to come here, which was my going around the world to visit eco-villages. And as Ina said, I've been teaching international environmental law, international environmental politics for 24 years at the University of Washington in Seattle. That's the good Washington, the Washington on the West Coast. And I'm very fortunate to have found a position where many people are deeply concerned about environmental issues, but very few of them actually know much about the global scope of these issues. Our students know a lot about local salmon and local forests, but they don't really understand the global scope, and that's what I'm really interested in. So, as Ina said, I worked for the last 7 years producing this book that's now almost out. This is the bound page proofs, and I will have 2 copies of it outside, free to you to take a look at, but please leave them here. And I'll also have flyers for the book. Okay. So Thich Nhat Hanh says that the next Buddha may be not an individual, but a community. And to my mind, this suggests that we have the possibility of developing a kind of collective consciousness. Now, I realize that coming from the Eastern European context, that might not sound like a very good idea, collective consciousness. After all, you really struggled for so many decades under this collectivization. But I believe that the eco-village concept is quite a different, progressive understanding of what this could possibly mean. So I'm going to suggest to you that eco-villages are really about changing the game. If we get a grasp of what the global environmental problematique, the set of problems, is that we're facing, we understand that the problem is the nature of the game. It's really not about individual people, it's really the nature of the game. So this graph here, this is the exponential growth of basically everything in society. Population, consumption growing even twice as fast as population. Exponential growth within a finite system is impossible over the long term. So we are playing a finite game. So this notion of infinite games, I'm just curious, how many of you know this understanding of infinite game? Have you ever heard this concept? Maybe a few of you. So Howard Rheingold, who started this Whole Earth catalog back in the late 1960s, he said that we are as gods and we better get good at it. And he said that we are, if you are playing the game to win, the nature of a game in which you are playing to win is that at the end of the game, whoever wins, wins, and that's the end of the game. It's a finite game. So any game in which the goal is to win is by nature a finite game. We are playing a finite game on the planet. The nature of an infinite game is that it can be continued indefinitely. It can go on and on. And so the nature of an infinite game is you play for the sake of playing. Yeah? So I'm going to suggest to you that eco-villages are changing the nature of the game. And they're changing the nature of the game by changing the story, the central story within that motivates the playing of the game. And as I went around the world, I lived in 14 eco-villages over the course of a year, and all over the world on 5 continents. And what I found is that even though they varied tremendously, villages in Africa are very different from Los Angeles Eco-Village in Hollywood, for instance. But common to all of these communities is a core understanding that the web of life is sacred, and that we as human beings are an integral part of that web, but we're not living that way. So the point is to learn how to live that way, and that positive change will come primarily from the bottom up, not from the top down. My own field being international environmental law, part of the reason that I took this journey is that I realized that the top-down initiatives of treaties and institutions are not really working. We need them, but they're not sufficient, not nearly. And eco-village living is an adventure in what I call integrative sustainability. And this is the idea of integrating ecology, economics, community, and consciousness. Am I speaking too fast? Okay, good, thank you. I know I have this cowboy English. I don't have your elegant accents. This is having, grown up in the U.S. and it's really about what I call a do-it-yourself politics, a DIY, do-it-yourself politics of yes. And that is, rather than resisting the thing that we don't want, we move towards the thing that we want. It's actually a very radical idea politically, because most politics is about protest, demonstration, trying to change the legislation, trying to get the government to change things, rather than we simply go out and we create the society that we want here on the ground. And so that means really being the change. So in this integrative sustainability, this dynamic integration of ecology, economics, community, and consciousness, we are really moving from the age of separation to the age of reconnection. And that's really what I think is so exciting about ecology. It's really about reconnecting ourselves to the world. And this is a world-centric, not egocentric and not ethnocentric understanding of what the nature of this game is that we're playing. To the extent that eco-villages call themselves spiritual, and some do and some don't, I would say it's a relational, embodied spirituality. It's not about meditating on some mountain and going up into some transcendental consciousness, but it's about understanding relationship. And even among the secular eco-villages that I visited, I would say that they are also engaged in this kind of relational consciousness and a great commitment to self-transformation. So being the change really means agreeing to be changed. And if you live in an eco-village, you will be changed as a consequence. So that's why I say that sustainability is an inside job. It's not just about changing the external structures, the external technologies, our green buildings, our solar panels, our waste treatments facilities. All of this is really a reflection of our consciousness. So it's really about living a new story that, from at least my American context, I see as a story beyond hyper-individualism. And that because we are inseparable from nature, we can actually access the evolutionary intelligence that brought us here. So if we are not separate from nature, and that actually is what science tells us, then we have the evolutionary intelligence of all of nature inside of us. And that's a very profound possibility for us. I'm just going to give you a few photographs to give you a feel for eco-villages. Different setting than, say, this room. This is at Findhorn, one of their little sanctuaries. And Findhorn is an eco-village in the north of Scotland. One of their sayings is to attune to earth, attune to spirit. So again, this integration of consciousness and ecology. And you can see, I think in a bit we'll hear a little bit about the spirit of place. And Findhorn is very much conscious of the spirit of its place in its buildings. So there's a kind of natural harmony here. And Findhorn is very good at growing food and growing people. That's one of the things that they do, is they grow people through workshops. People come from all over the world for the workshops. But the problem, of course, is that it's got this big ecological footprint, And so I looked at that and I wondered, on the one hand, people who are living there are living rather sustainably for a Western affluent country, and yet their economy is completely dependent upon jet travel. And they're very aware of this contradiction, this irony. And I think what they would say is that what they're trying to do is leverage the resources from the current system into creating a more sustainable world. And I think that's really what we all have to do. We acknowledge that the ways that we're living today are not sustainable. But then the question is, how do we gather together the tremendous wealth that our present system has created and leverage that wealth into producing another viable culture? Now, this is a older photograph from Siebenlinden. When I visited Siebenlinden, there was a community within Siebenlinden that was trying to live on a One Earth footprint called Club 99. And they used draft horses in their agriculture and in their forestry. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that this is a community, this is a vegan community. This was a vegan community within Siebenlinden. And they're trying to live within a One Earth footprint for the entire Earth, not just among Germans, but what it would take for if everybody in the world lived the way Siebenlinden lived, could we all live this way? And that was their goal. This was also a vegan community, and so they were not eating meat. That was part of their commitment to this very low impact lifestyle. And this is their Club 99 common house that was a very small ecological footprint. So I was surprised, though. I thought, oh, these people would be maybe living in such a primitive way that they would be obsessed with the material dimensions of their lifestyle. But they weren't. Actually, I had some of my most profound philosophical and political conversations there. So I think that this idea that we have that if you live in a very simple way, that you therefore cannot think in a very complex way, I think is really not, it's not the case. This is a very bad photograph from Svanholm in Denmark. This is a community that they told me that they were allergic to spirituality. And I was interested to know what this meant, because they have a common economy. And they are they don't have the negative association with collective living as maybe post-Soviet states would have, and they have a common economy, and I would say that the kinds of social and economic practices that they have of raising their children together, of co-owning many economic endeavors together, that this actually helps to move them from an individualistic consciousness to more of a group consciousness, but without losing the individualism. So this is really an important concept, I think, is the idea that when we move to another level of consciousness, that we don't simply leave behind the benefits of the previous level of consciousness. In other words, I'm interested in a post-individualistic society that incorporates the glories of individualism. And I think that this is possible, and I saw some evidence of this at Svanholm. This is Damenhur, the very fanciful community in the foothills of the Alps of Italy. And here they've built underground temples. They were kept secret, and they're architectural marvels, really architectural marvels. And they believe that the earth is alive, and that we as human beings are like the sense organs of the earth. And they do various rituals and practices within the temples here. But they're also very attuned to the economic realities of life. So this is one of the most successful complementary currencies in a eco-village that I found. So they did not want their money to be associated with greed and violence. And so they actually pulled their money, their entire economy out of the Italian lira system and now the euro system. Does not mean that they don't deal in euros, because they do, but they also had this added advantage of the solidarity that comes from a complementary currency. Now, we have many complementary currencies around the world, but they're pretty marginal. In this community, they're central because the community actually agreed at one point about 20 years ago that they simply would no longer allow euros into the community. It was a very radical, or it was a time it was lira. They would not allow that as being the currency of exchange. So it took a lot of solidarity to do this. And this is one of the reasons that the community is one of the more affluent eco-villages. Now, in Damanhur, people zip around in their cars quite a bit, and their ecological footprint is rather high. But I was interested in this community, Arboricoli, which has a very small ecological footprint because they live in tree houses. So and this is one community within Damanhur that is very focused on communicating with plants. So they figured if we're going to communicate with plants, well, we should live in the trees and see how close we can get to the consciousness of the plants. So I tell many stories about all of these communities in the book. And this is kind of a quick romp around. So one of the questions we always ask, those of us who are familiar with eco-villages, is, do we need urban eco-villages or rural eco-villages? I mean, after all, most of humanity is now living in the urban world. We're living in cities. So it seems that the great need is for urban eco-villages. And I think this is true. However, I would say that there's very important reasons to focus on rural villages, which is, I understand, the focus here. So at the top here, we have, this is critical mass. This is one of the activities that is organized in many of the city eco-villages. It's also a practice, you could say, that follows from eco-village logic, and you don't need an eco-village to do this, which is just get as many bicyclists on the road to jam the roads as possible. And so critical mass is something that Los Angeles Eco-Village has been instrumental in organizing to get out of the car culture. Oh, this is very important because many rural eco-villages, if they're more modern, are depending upon cars. And that's one of our least sustainable forms of consumption. So the rural eco-villages are more beautiful, I would say, personally, and are producing much more food. Urban eco-villages, for the most part, are not producing a lot of food. But on the other hand, people are driving more. So what to do? Now, I think for myself, I have a global perspective on this. And I recognize that most people in the world live in the developing world. So I'm very interested in solutions at that level. And so one of the things I wanted to look at is the development of eco-villages or eco-village consciousness within the developing world context. And here I think it's very important, this is probably something that's relevant in this context, is that you have young people leaving the traditional villages because economically and intellectually very often, there's just simply not much there for them. Life is not very exciting. So they're leaving the villages. But in the process of doing so, old skills are being lost quickly. People don't know how to grow food. People don't know how to raise animals. Blacksmithing, welding, all of these very physical skills that we have known for millennia as human beings are being lost very quickly. And so there's also, as a consequence, a generation gap. The old people and young people are speaking different languages. They're playing a different game, you could say. And so you see this especially in the developing world, where technological progress has been so fast, relatively. So when I went to Africa, I visited Kolififa, which is an eco-village network in Senegal. It's basically a participatory development network working with 350 rural villages in West Africa, primarily Senegal. And the challenge here is a very different challenge than it is in the global north. The challenge here is how to keep people in a more traditional context, how to make the existing villages sustainable, not just ecologically, but yes, that's true as well, but economically. How do you develop economic opportunities for people in their villages so that they don't need to go to the cities? Because when they go to the cities, their ecological footprint will increase inevitably. So how do we make existing villages more sustainable? And this is something that Colafifa and Sarvodia, the two participatory development networks that I visited, are doing. Promoting organic farming was very important there, but also microfinance programs for women, very important. These are some of the, I don't speak French, so pardon my accent, agence polyvalence. It's polyvalent agents. We'll just say polyvalent agents, and these are people who, as they say themselves, we do anything, anywhere, anytime. And so they do whatever is necessary to promote village development, and they travel by motorbike and by bus from village to village. These are young people who have not left their village, but in Africa, in West Africa, and most of the developing world, most young men have left their villages. So what do you do about this? You need to find ways of making life viable in the village. So this was my translator. At the time, he was 33 years old. His annual income was equivalent to about 60 euros a year. And at the time, he was supporting 3 children and his wife on this. He just died a couple of months ago. He was, at the time, supporting 11 people, including the orphan children of his uncle, and he's dead now. And I really don't know what will happen to his family. And so this is the kind of just very dire straits that you find people in. He told me that even at that time when he was making the equivalent of 60 euros a year, half of his salary every year went to malaria treatments. And so I began to understand why many development NGOs, rather than prioritizing energy development and all of these other possibilities that we might think of for the villages, they work on malaria, on mosquito issues. So if the young men are leaving, then what do we do? And so here was one village that I visited in the Gambia, and they were building a boat. So this boat was carved out of one tree, one huge tree. This is the boat builder here, and this young man, Lamin, he was the polyvalent agent who was helping this village. Now, why are they building a fishing boat for men who don't know how to swim? They don't know how to fish. They've never seen the ocean. And they're all going to, groups of them are going to go out on these boats and go to the ocean to fish. Well, as I saw it, it seemed to me that it actually made sense. There was food in the ocean, and there was possible economic livelihood. I don't know to what degree it would be ecologically sustainable, harvesting tilapia from the ocean, maybe 100 kilometers away. And I'm sure many of them would die at sea, but many more of them were dying at sea trying to get to Europe. And so this was a way, in a sense, of giving these young men a tremendous, challenging, physical, psychological adventure to go to sea, to bring food home to their villages. And it would be a way of keeping them in the village, because young men need to have a sense of adventure and accomplishment. In a sense, it was a kind of rite of passage that this village had designed for themselves in order to have the possibility of keeping the men there. This, I think, is something that all communities need to think. What do we do to keep our young people happy and wanting to stay where they are so that we don't have this mass exodus? How are we doing on time, Ina? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Oh, no problem. So now the Senegal president has announced that there will be a world summit on eco-villages, and eco-villages are a central part of the Senegalese development policy. They have formed an eco-village ministry, first country in the world, as far as I know, to have an eco-village ministry. And their idea is essentially what we're saying here, how to create a sustainable livelihood and social structure within existing traditional villages so that people do not leave the villages. And I don't know whether the president of Senegal is playing an infinite game or a finite game, because politicians generally don't play infinite games. But what I do know is that, well, I know some do. But what I do know is that many of the people who are involved in this movement at the grassroots level, they are playing an infinite game. And this is their aspiration. And so this initiative, I think, will be very important. This is Sarvodia, the other participatory development network that I visited. This is in Sri Lanka. And Sarvodia is one of the largest village development networks in the world, even though it's a very small country. In this country of 20 million people, about 10 million people are members of Sarvodia. Sarvodia is a Gandhian term that means the awakening of all. And Sarvodia is a member of GEN, the Global Eco-Village Network. And so even though it's an unconventional eco-village, in the sense that it's more like 15,000, quote, eco-villages, I felt that I needed to visit Sarvodia because it is the largest member of GEN. Their goal is, their aim is to create a no poverty, no affluence society. Sarvodia means the awakening of all, and it is a Gandhian term. And the whole organization is organized around the principle of Shramadana. Shramadana means the gift of labor. And so Sarvodia will bring the technological and the financial resources to a village that will organize itself to donate its labor on behalf of a project. So it's a very democratic process. A village comes together and they think together, what do we need? And in these democratic processes, part of it is that women have to be as represented as men. And they think, what do we need? Do we need a school? Do we need a well? Do we need something for malaria? Do we need solar panels? What is it that we need? And they decide together, and then they go to Sarvodia with a proposal. And the first thing Sarvodia does, what do you think the first thing Sarvodia would do with a village like this? Well, they teach them how to meditate. That's the first thing they do. They learn how to meditate. Because for Sarvodia, every ecological, social, and economic problem is at root a problem of consciousness. And so they learned a very simple peace meditation that's really, we could pretty much do it right here and now. It's as you breathe in, you recognize your connection to all of life. And as you breathe out, you recognize that you're giving your breath to all of life. And you simply watch your breath with this sense of deep interdependence. And so Sarvodia is really very much about the transformation of consciousness that I mentioned in the beginning. And that's built into their program. But they also build roads and wells, and they put solar panels in, and they dig wells, and whatever it is that people decide they need. And it's a very successful development organization. This is Lagoshwate, which is after the tsunami in 2004. They built 2005. It was December of 2004, I think, actually arrived, like a week after it happened. Not Sarvodia, I was in South India at the time, but yeah, in any case, there was a big tsunami. Many people lost their homes, particularly in fishing villages, and so they built several brand new villages from the ground up for people who had been displaced, and they got very, very simple, but very functional homes. Each home has its own kitchen garden, and then there's a collective garden where the village grows its own food. As you see, there's electricity. but each house has one solar panel, which is sufficient for just the bare minimum. And they have their own schools. They have their own basically self-organized village structure. Again, Sarvodia, they say, we build the road and the road builds us. So we do this physical labor, and we are transformed in the process. This is a micro-lending project, a little bank in one of the villages. This is Auroville. This is an experiment in human unity in South India. This, in some ways, is not exactly an eco-village. They call themselves an international township, but they are a member of GEN, and everybody in GEN certainly knows about them because they're very large and successful. This is a community of people who came to live this vision of human unity. So it's at root a spiritual community. But they understood that we can't have human unity unless we are living that ecologically as well. So the first thing they did was they planted 3 million trees. And this is a community with over 2,000 people from 43 different countries. So it's a very huge experiment in cross-cultural communication. And lucky for me, the British colonized the world, and so most of them speak English. And so I was able to do many interviews, and actually I led a study abroad program to Auroville for many years. This is the Matra Mandir, this really quite magnificent meditation structure that's right in the center of the community. And it is certainly the most ecologically intensive structure in the community. But for them, they feel that this is about the transformation of consciousness. And so they've made a very conscious decision to devote a sizable portion of their ecological footprint to this temple. And so that really, I have a section in the book called The Ecological Footprint of Enlightenment. And so if the point of being a human being is to develop our consciousness, how do we do that in an ecologically harmonious way? I think that's also the question that Findhorn must address with respect to its conference economy. And this is Konohana, one of my favorite communities in Japan. It's a farming community. Everybody who lives in the community works in some way for the farm, either growing the food or processing the food. Everything in the community is around the food. And they also work very much with effective microorganisms, EM, which is beneficial microorganisms for the human system, also for ecosystems. This is at the base of Mount Fuji, as you see, so it's a really beautiful community. And in this part of Japan, as in most of Asia and much of the world, young people have left the villages. And so there's old people here who are too old to farm. They can't use their land. And so this community uses the local farmland that's not being used otherwise. And it's a community now of about 85 people, but many thousands of people visit every year. This is, I think, one of the most important things about eco-villages is that they have a strong ripple effect, even though they're small very often. And 85 is not so small, but considering that tens of thousands of people will travel through Konohana and feel what it feels like to live that way, it has a kind of homeopathic effect on the larger culture, we could say, just like the salt in the soup, as Ina said. This was a painting that's on their wall that I thought was really lovely. This kind of depicts their worldview, which is the idea that we as humans, this is us, this little baby here, this little baby, we are the ones who are all holding the planet in our hands, and we hold the fate of the earth in our hands. And what's most important, though, is that we are held in this larger, benevolent being or intelligence, whichever you might say, and that we can sort of rest into that and live from that place. So they say before we cultivate the field, we cultivate our mind. And so every day they have practices that are really about understanding how close have we come to living in this consciousness rather than the little tiny consciousness of being a little human being. So these eco-villages, just to sum up, are kind of post-consumer micro-societies. They're small, but they're showing ways of circumventing the global economy. One way is to have a low or no mortgage. That helps a lot, because if you have a large land debt, it's very hard to be, especially in the affluent world, to be ecologically and to have any kind of self-sufficiency. Sharing is the key to eco-village life, and I would say not just material sharing, although that's important, but sharing a sense of purpose. Because if you're not sharing a sense of purpose with people, then you're probably going to find yourself at the level of individual differences a lot. So having that sense of shared purpose is really key. And if you don't, you'll probably be working at cross purposes because you don't have that common purpose. And one of the things that I love about eco-villages is that even though they're small and they tend to be having a fairly local focus, they have a global sensibility. So in the developed world, in the industrialized world, people spoke to me very often about wanting to live more simply so that others could simply live. They had this global consciousness. So there's a strong ripple effect among eco-villages into the larger culture. And then being in the field of international relations, I felt challenged. How do we scale this up? How do we scale up these small lessons to the larger culture? And so I suggest that there's, in the last chapter of the book, that first of all, you have this as a purpose. You have sustainability as a purpose. You have the playing of an infinite game as a purpose, as a central purpose, perhaps the central purpose. And within that, you need, first of all, systemic thinking, linking E2 and E2C2, subsidiarity, and by this I mean not just political subsidiarity where decisions are made as locally as possible, but ecological subsidiarity. So in other words, how do we maintain and even grow our sense as a global species, because we are a global species now, and do so sustainably? We can't do it with existing practices. And so how can we find, for instance, what we might call a low-energy cosmopolitanism? You know, that I think is really the key, a key challenge. Sharing, and I say that the future of consumption is collaborative, and by this I mean if you look at the leading edge of consumption in the affluent countries, it's actually not in private ownership anymore. It's actually in things like 2 minutes? Okay. It's actually in things like shared car sharing, co-ownership. Even the internet is, in a sense, a collaborative consumption. Designing for the future and the power of yes. So how do we change the game? This is this little guy here. He's Archimedes. He said, if you give me a lever, I can move the world. So how do we then leverage our current resources to create a viable society? And I think the first thing is we change the nature of our purpose. So we really need to ask, what is the game we are playing? That's a really foundational question. So what is the game we are playing? This I visited Grotto Park here the other day when I first came. And it was quite amazing to see these imposing statues of what people here lived under for decades. And that was the game then. The game was really about power, aggression, intimidation, fear. That was the game, as I understand it. I didn't live that game, but that's the game that I saw in these statues. But what is the game we are playing today? I like this little here. This is our little infinity. Yeah, infinity through cooperation. This is actually a photograph from the Herschel telescope of our galaxy. Now, it's true that this is actually drawn in, but what they have found that, now I'm not going to attach any great meaning to this, but my poetic self just wanted to give you this image. Our galaxy actually has a band of an energy band encircling it in the form of an infinity sign. Well, that's interesting. Okay, this is the little yurt where I wrote my book, and thank you.